I'll go the camera when.
Okay. What's your name?
Jim Lynch.
Jim Lynch. Yeah. Are you American?
No, I'm Canadian. Yep.
Were you born before or after World War II?
After.
But which part of Canada?
Ottawa. Lived in Ottawa all my life. And probably better just ask the questions. So,
Trying to get some context, for your familiarity.
Well, I was born in Ottawa, and I joined the Canadian government. I worked for the Canadian Foreign Ministry for 36 years. I was posted in Israel. I was also posted to the Canadian mission to the United Nations in Geneva. I worked in our Middle East division, the UN division, and I've been retired now for a little over 10 years. And I've been to Israel, I've been to Gaza. I've been to Gaza about 14 times, but I haven't been to Gaza in about 15 years. But from 1975 until roughly 1980, I went to Gaza 14 times. I was guest of UNRWA. So I went to a number of the local political leaders, the local Gazans. I went to a couple of lunches there, and I went swimming. I traveled the whole length of the Gaza Strip and into neighboring Egypt, when Egypt was still occupied by Israel. Israel returned that part.
Been to Sinai?
The Sinai part that borders on Gaza was a much different place. Israel was a different place. When I first went, Israel was a relatively poor country. Very few people had private cars.
Which year was that?
1975, April 1975, long time ago. For most of the young people here, they weren't alive. But Israel, it was 2 years after the October War. You had started asking about the history. So I think...
Been there. Did you deal with any of the Gazan or Palestinian politicians or government people?
Nobody who's active now. This was pre-Hamas. And so the people we dealt with were UNRWA officials, both international civil servants and local Gazans. In the West Bank, I dealt with the mayors of Bethlehem, Ramallah, Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarm. I met them. One of the mayors subsequently had his legs blown off, but for about 3 to 5 years, I was very well acquainted with Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. That's a long time ago, so at that time I had a professional involvement in it, but I haven't had a professional involvement for a long time. I've been back to Israel, though, since 1975, I've been back to Israel probably around 20 times, and I've also traveled in the West Bank.
You're a bit like Mark Twain, right? You've been there early on. Well, he was there in the 1800s.
He was entirely different time. My early time is somewhat relevant. And in that time, Israel at that time had a gross national product per capita, which was lower than most countries in the OECD. And in that time frame, you hold it, in that time frame, so from 1975 until now, Israel went from a poor country to being a rich country.
Because it was communistic at first, right?
No, they weren't. They never actually went communist.
Socialist.
They were
socialist, sorry.
They were a socialist country.
You're right.
And although there were a lot of people who wanted it to go that way, they never went that way. And but the Labour Party, which would be comparable to the middle to the left of today's Democratic Party, was in control for a long time. And they had a major national trade union which owned almost all the industry.
Which is a gold? Yes.
By the way, is this dead skin you have here on?
Yes, it's dead skin.
Can you scratch it off?
No, it's either you get what you...
Come together to combat anti-Semitism.
I'll put it in the shadow. It's all right.
Don't worry. I can put the hat on if that helps.
No, it's worse. That's it.
That's the point. But I think more than my history, what's relevant is the history of the place, and to the extent that I think there are important stages, so that in modern times, the Turks had an empire.
The Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman, but by that time it wasn't so much Ottoman as Turkish. So that there were a group of young radicals who had overthrown the religious government and the emperor in Istanbul, and they had taken power, and they threw in their lot with the Germans. And the British defeated the Turks and the Germans.
This is World War I.
This is World War I. In 1917, they went in and they liberated Jerusalem. At the end of the war, the League of Nations gave the British mandates in several places. The original British mandate included what is now modern Jordan, Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza.
Those were the countries that were given to Britain
The original mandate.
to turn into countries.
No, they gave them to the British with certain conditions, but turning them into countries was a very long-term goal stated in the 1920s, Winston Churchill, who was the British minister responsible, in order to repay the debt that some people in Britain felt that Britain owed the Arabs, divided that mandate, creating Jordan under King Abdullah's great-great-grandfather, and creating British Mandatory Palestine. The British ran it for about 40 years, from 1918, and they had this mandate. When the independent, and during that time, there were riots and the rest of that, and the British proposed dividing the divided mandate into two, giving roughly those areas which were a major Jewish population to a Jewish state, and those areas which were Arab to an Arab state. It was called the Peel Commission Report Plan, the Peel Plan. Later on, when things became too difficult for the British, both because of Jewish nationalism revolting and Arab nationalism, they turned it over to the UN. The UN set up a special committee on Palestine, and that group also recommended dividing the British Mandatory Palestine into two, using the same principle. Those areas which were heavily Jewish, going to the new Jewish state, and those states which were heavily Arab to the Arab state, with Jerusalem being an international city.
But wasn't essentially Jordan, wasn't Jordan, Transjordan carved out of Palestine, 70% of mandate Palestine?
And the original one that the British divided. Yeah. So that the British took that out and made it into an all-Arab state under a monarch who came originally from Saudi Arabia. Back before Saudi Arabia existed. King Abdullah is part of a family called the Hashemites. They came from a certain part of Saudi Arabia. They were overthrown and thrown out by the Saud family. And the British still felt that they could have useful dealings with them. So they put in both Jordan and in Iraq, they put members of the Hashemite family. If you watch the film Lawrence of Arabia and understand it, you'll know all of this. Lawrence of Arabia gives all the film Lawrence of Arabia gives all of the history. Any of it. The UN plan was accepted by David Ben-Gurion, who was the head of the Jewish Agency, even though he said, and his argument was, it's better to have a Jewish state, no matter how small, if it's going to be peaceful and recognized by the world, even if we have to give up Jerusalem and a lot of this territory.
You're talking about 1947.
47, 48, yep.
It had already been carved out of Palestine.
About 25 years before. So Jordan was not completely independent. The British still ran the military. But King Abdullah was in power and he ran basically the internal affairs of the country. But again, remember, he was a foreign monarch put in, a foreign Arab Muslim monarch put in, who had strong roots with the rural people. The Bedouin and the rural people supported him. The city people weren't that happy with the Hashemite king of Jordan. But King Abdullah was a very wise man, very, very wise man. He was assassinated in Jerusalem at the Haram al-Sharif, the Temple Mount. Anyway, getting back. So the Palestinian representative, the Palestinian representatives and the Arab states
Thank you again.
rejected
DJ Justin, take it away.
the partition plan.
From
And immediately after that, 5 Arab states invaded what was to become Israel. And they thought that they would win the war. There was a surprise, and they didn't win the war. And Israel gained more territory than they did. We can get into all sorts of details, but that's the basic starting point. We can go into other things, but I think in terms of the starting point, there was never a sovereign Palestine state. There was a British colonial territory which had been given to the British under a mandate from the League of Nations. They had certain conditions, but the conditions were not that rigorous. They contemplated that eventually British mandatory Palestine would become an independent state, but more along the lines of how Canada and Australia became independent countries.
So essentially, in the 1940s, the French and British mandates became independent sovereigns. Right?
40s.
Right.
Yep.
Right. But you refer to Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia was already independent. So in the
1940s, yes. But Chaim Weizmann did a deal made an arrangement with the emir of the Saudi, right, to go to England, and they said that Saudi Arabia would support that he would get the Arabs to support a Jewish state in Palestine if they'd make Muslim states in the rest of the places. Is that right?
Yeah. Time frame is a little bit earlier, but again, we're talking about the deal that Weizmann did was with the Hashemites. He didn't do the deal with the Saudis. He did the deal with the Hashemites.
He did a letter with the Saudis.
He did a letter, but the deal was with the Hashemites. And the Saudis, they're named after King Saud, the first leader, and it's called Saudi Arabia after him. And that's his personal flag. That's their flag. King Faisal was a very intelligent, very moderate man. King Abdullah was similar, but a little bit more cunning, a little bit more political. But King Abdullah was also willing to do deals with Israel. So the Hashemites were both a religious leader and also a political leader. And so they got some of their loyalty from the Arab population because they were religious leaders. The Ottoman Empire was both a religious and a political empire. Before this group of young Turks, the expression young Turks comes from these revolutionary Turkish military officers who overthrew the combined political, religious empire of the Ottoman Turks. And in some ways, the real problem came because these young Turks threw in their lot with Germany. And that forced the British to invade because having the Turks with their German allies right on the border of the Suez Canal was a threat to British interests. So they went in. That's where Lawrence of Arabia comes in and all the rest of that.
The Arabs who are here and the Muslims from other countries are alleging that Israel is an illegitimate state and stole Palestinians' land. Stole it. Is that accurate?
Going back to Roman times, so the Romans drove the Jews out of different names, but they drove the Jews out. A small group of Jews, and they drove them out in two different time periods, two different times. Even after most of the Jews had been driven out by the Romans, a small Jewish population remained in what is now Israel. And they were, to the extent that there is an indigenous people still alive, they are the indigenous people of Israel. They weren't huge, but they had certain cities. And the other thing was that even under the Turks, For example, this is just an example. Under the Turks, Jerusalem has been a majority Jewish city since 1872. So these people came back primarily for religious reasons to live in Jerusalem. So that there's been a significantly large Jewish population. And at the time of Israel's independence, there were roughly 1,200,000 Muslim and Christian Arabs and about 650,000 Jewish Israelis.
But when the United Nations Partition of Palestine plan was released in November of 1947, they deemed that Israel should be a Jewish state, and there could be an Arab state in Palestine, which the Arabs rejected. Isn't that right?
Okay, in order to accept that, so that there was a significant, we're talking about roughly 600,000 people. You say that it should be a Arab state only would be the same as what happened to the Jews in Algeria and Morocco. They were basically driven out, so that the UN said, we'll cut the loaf in half. There are already areas, for example, Tel Aviv was created by the Jews in 1905. Still under the Turks, a group of Jewish people on the sand dunes started what became Tel Aviv. And that had never been an Arab city. The Jews bought the land for money from the Arabs, so that both the British partition plan and the UN partition plan are based on the principle that we're going to try to treat groups of people fairly. And so so Jews were already a majority population in places like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and some other cities. And so by linking all those Jewish majority communities together, we came up with a Jewish majority state. Would have been even smaller than what Israel is now. But the UN had other things where they thought that there could be cooperation between two states. And they were optimistic, too optimistic, but it was both the British under Peel and the UN under this group. And there were many developing countries that were part of and it was a majority vote. So both of these plans may be idealistic, but they thought that they could come up with something where by separating the people and then having a link in Jerusalem that should be able to create a federal state eventually. As I said, Ben-Gurion was willing to accept it. Later on, under President Clinton, the Prime Minister of Israel, a man by the name of Barak, was willing to accept a similar plan in which the area where the Golden Dome is, in English we call it the Temple Mount, Muslims call it the Haram al-Sharif, where that would have been under Palestinian sovereignty with the Palestinian flag. Yasser Arafat rejected that plan. That was about the most that you could expect from a modern Israeli government. It still has within it, if you understand the religion and the history and the rest of that, there are extremists on both sides who wouldn't accept it. But in terms of what is physically there, in terms of sharing something which three religions claim, you have to come up with some sort of practicable, workable plan. Israel has twice in my lifetime, I'm 75, going on 76, been willing to accept something which on the surface of it was against Jewish interests, but for a greater good, for a close, durable peace, they were willing to accept it. On the both occasions, the Arab side has rejected the plan without even saying, let's see if it works, we'll give it a try.
It's short. How accurate would it be to say that Israel is not a legitimate state?
Israel is a legitimate... To be a legitimate state, all you have to do under international law is exercise practical sovereignty over a territory. The United States, for example, the difference is de facto, in fact, and de jure recognition of a state. And there are many states, for example, the Allies during World War II recognized the governments of Holland, France, Poland, who were not in control of the territory. In some cases, German puppet governments, but nevertheless, the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and all of the Allies recognized these states even though they weren't in control of their country. So that Israel's a legitimate state, and there's no question that Israel is a legitimate state. Now, we won't go too far. Last two more questions, and then we'll call it quits. Okay?
This way because they keep turning the.
So, and you know a lot anyway. Some of this I'm just fine tuning.
I know about it. You know, I studied my history. I'm Jewish. I'm educated. I educated myself. But there seems to be two truths now, right? It seems that the Palestinians and the Muslim world have got their own reality. That's ahistorical.
The Muslim world's big. The Muslim world's over 1 billion people, and it includes countries that are both Arab and non-Arab countries. And there are many people in the Muslim and Arab world who are very practical. Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and there are maybe 3 or 4 more that are very realistic. And some of these countries are countries that have made great economic and social progress in the last 30 years. If the people in Gaza had got enough money and had the same spirit as the people in either Dubai or Abu Dhabi, Gaza would be an economic powerhouse. Even with the very small territory that it has the same things going for it. Dubai has no oil. People don't realize it. Dubai has no oil.
No, but they're the banking center of all the petro money.
Their biggest source of income is actually tourism. Dubai, their biggest source of income is tourism and real estate. They're an important banking area. They're an important one, but they are a multifaceted country, a very small country, not much bigger than an independent Gaza.
So, what's your sense now of the liberal parties in Canada and U.S. towards this conflict?
She doesn't know what I'm doing on
It's difficult to support the Liberal Party of Canada for all sorts of reasons. Right now, the Liberal Party of Canada has lost its way. If an election were held today, the Liberal Party of Canada would be massively defeated, not only because of its Middle East policy, but because of a number of other things. Most young people in Canada do not support the Liberal Party of Canada. They either support the Conservative Party or the Socialist Party, which we call NDP. So that this inability to have a clear, balanced policy and stick to it is not just a Middle East issue, but the Liberal Party today is lost. The Conservative Party is a much better party. The Democratic Party in the United States, I'm not an American. I follow American politics a lot. I have 2 American daughters now and 3 American grandchildren. And so it interests me. And when I was a young man, I was a big supporter of John F. Kennedy. Although not as bad as the Liberal Party in Canada, the Democratic Party in the United States has lost its way. It's confused. It's particularly confused on the question of Israel. They're not quite sitting on the fence, but they're not much farther away from it. It's causing great turmoil and heartbreak amongst many, many Americans. It would be better for the United States as a nation and for its different groups if the Democratic Party could speak with a more clear voice. From where I stand, and people will probably guess where I stand. The leadership, particularly on the issue of protecting Jews on campus, is being carried by the Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives, particularly Chairwoman Fox and Representative Elise Stefanik, whose district borders on where I come from in Canada. She borders upstate New York. She has provided real leadership in the best traditions of the United States. And on that note, I salute all those people, especially Elise Stefanik and people who take flight from. I thank you. I hope some of that is useful.
Let me say.